Good morning, and we welcome you to today's webinar. I am the Reverend Dr. Sandana Gallman Ashley, and I serve as your transitional Synod leader. We're so happy to have you to be a part of our first webinar of this fall, and we thank you so much for being here. As we begin today, we ask that you would remain on mute. We are recording this session for today, and we want to make sure that we have a good recording that we can share in the future, and that you also can use for a resource for your presbytery or your congregation. Our webinar today will be led by the Reverend Dr. Theresa Latini, a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA and the author of The Church and the Crisis of Community, a practical theology of small group ministry, and the co-author of Transforming Church Conflict, Compassionate Leadership in Action. Dr. Latini has consulted with congregations and conflicted groups for over a decade and applied the skills of nonviolent communication to the work of diversity and cultural competency in her prior work as a seminary professor and an administrator. She is the current executive director of the Mount Olivet Conference and Retreat Center in Farmington, Minnesota. We are very happy to have her with us today. Welcome, Dr. Latini, to the Synod of the Northeast.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be able to spend some time with you all this morning. And feels like a little bit like coming home, since I am from New York, but I've spent a good portion of my career out here in the Midwest. As Reverend Ashley was mentioning, I've held a number of roles in seminaries and churches and even nonprofits throughout my career. And as varied as these contexts have been, there seems to be at least one constant, and that is that often the greatest obstacles to growth, to change, to fulfilling an organization's mission are really related to the inability of these systems to faithfully and effectively navigate difference, disagreement, and outright conflict. So, like it is true for just about every preacher that I know, it's true for me. We teach what we need most. So, what I share with you today comes out of my own personal experience and need as a leader in a variety of places. Just a few things on logistics for today. You should have received this morning 3 different handouts. One is a needs inventory, and then 2 worksheets. If you have them available, that would facilitate some of our conversation or time of practice. If you don't have them available, I will have some PowerPoint slides that support you anyway. When I'm done presenting today, I will send all of the slides from my presentation to Reverend Ashley, and then she can share them with all of you. So don't feel as though you need to be taking notes fast and furiously, because I will make sure you get all of those. We will, at a couple of points, because of the size of our group, use breakout rooms, and you'll be assigned to those automatically, I believe, and we'll be in and out of those for a few minutes at a time. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. I will structure some time for pauses where questions can be answered, and I'll be having some help monitoring those questions as well as any comments. So having said that, I'm going to share my screen, get that going, and we will jump in. And just so you know, I'm going to start with some background and conceptual framing of the skills that I'm going to share with you today. And then again, we'll have some time to process on our own and together. Okay. So the focus today is on how to cultivate compassionate and courageous communication, particularly in the time which we live. And What I'm sharing with you grows out of a set of skills and practices and even an international peacemaking organization called Nonviolent Communication. I was first introduced to this when I was a doctoral student at Princeton Theological Seminary. I had also just gotten ordained. I was working at a church that had been significantly traumatized with multiple pastors who had committed clergy sexual misconduct in the past. And in part as a result, conflict kept emerging in really strange ways in that setting. And members were often confused about healthy boundaries, and the clergy who were so concerned about the healing of that congregation often overworked to the point of ill health. So right around that time, as I was trying to navigate this system, I was introduced to this practice called nonviolent communication. And it's important too, in terms of context, to say that this for me was the early to late 90s. And there was a ton of vitriol in the Presbyterian Church related to sexuality debates. And like so many other members of the LGBTQIA community, those debates were kind of fought through and over my personhood. So I had a sense of the way, because sort of vitriol and conflict and deep ideological divides could impact my own humanity and the humanity of others. Um, so right around that time, I get introduced to nonviolent communication. And for some reason, let's see, okay. And then eventually wrote a book with a former professor and friend, colleague of mine, Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger from Princeton Theological Seminary as well. She taught pastoral theology there. So I just dove in and learned, stopped counting at about 950 hours of training in NVC, and then a similar practice called restorative circles. And what I have to say is, over the time that I've been practicing this, these skills are not a guarantee of peace. They're not like a sure way for healing or reconciliation to emerge, but these skills create the possibility for that. And it does so in a way, I think, that has integrity with, for instance, the Hebrew Bible vision of shalom, or the New Testament depiction of koinonia, or with this admonition from St. Paul: if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And I just love the caveats there, that if it's possible, and so far as it depends on you. So I've been at this for a long time. I find that I need it in my daily work as a leader. And I hope in our short time together today, simply to give you a taste of compassionate communication or nonviolent communication, and a little bit about its core skill, so that it can help you begin to shift in meaningful ways to connect with others across deep divides while still holding on to your core values. And that's a key for me in all of this. So for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with nonviolent communication, or compassionate communication, as it's sometimes called, it's important to know that it is, on the one hand, a full-blown model of conflict transformation with basic skills, skill sets, and advanced skills. It's also a set of communication practices, which is more how I'm going to be sharing it with you today. And then it's as well an international peacemaking organization with certified trainers all over the world. Now, as a set of practices for communication, I think compassionate communication or nonviolent communication teaches us, or even trains us, to listen for what matters most to ourselves and others, especially in moments of conflict. It helps us to empathetically connect with those who hold wildly differing viewpoints. So it doesn't, it's not lost on me that we're talking about this on the morning of the first presidential debate of this season. And I think too, it trains us not just in listening, but in speaking with courage, with compassion and conviction. And it does that by grounding us in our deepest values so that we can communicate with integrity. If you wanted to make it even simpler, you could think about this as a process for connecting with others at the level of our common humanity. In case some of you know a bit about nonviolent communication or want to learn more, let me just say too that as a model for transforming conflict, it can help us do things like transform criticism into opportunities for mutual understanding. It can teach us to stay in dialogue in the midst of that difference and disagreement. Can help us heal pain from unresolved conflict, shame, and guilt. This is, I think, really critical in the current moment, which we don't have time for, but it's a little more of advanced skill, but it can teach us to transform our anger and our enemy images as we work for social justice so that we do so in a way that is in keeping, again, with that vision for shalom. And again, it can help us also mediate between two or more people who themselves may be in conflict. Now, nonviolent communication, as I've adapted it, comes from a man named Marshall Rosenberg, who spent more than half of his life developing and teaching it. He was trained as a clinical psychologist. He left his practice in the 1960s in order to support persons, families, and communities in living more peacefully with each other. Over about a 50 to 60 year period, he mediated conflict from kind of at every level. And at points, he was in Rwanda working with the Hutus and Tutsis. He worked with Israelis and Palestinians, and in lots of sectors here in the United States and Europe. And then it was around him that grew this international peacemaking organization. And personally, it was that organization that was significantly pivotal in my own formation as a leader. I spent about 3 years studying with a very religiously and socioeconomically, educationally diverse group of people who were committed to somehow figuring out how to live more peacefully with others in the many contexts of their lives. So Rosenberg is a significant figure. You can learn a little bit more about him and the very basics of nonviolent communication through this classic book that he wrote, Nonviolent Communication, A Language for Life. What you'll see throughout his writings, and you may hear traces of today, is that he was significantly inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and his approach really reflects their commitments as well as his own background in psychology. So throughout my more than a decade now or so of learning and teaching and offering nonviolent communication or compassionate communication, one of the shifts I've seen is where I used to talk about difference and disagreement. I'm more likely now to frame our contexts with words like vitriol and chasms and what seems like irreparable ideological divides. And whether I've practiced nonviolent communication in relationship to people who stand across those divides from me, or simply in relationship to myself as I experience those divides and the painful vitriol, I have found it to be sort of a timeless set of helpful practices that sustain me as a leader. Because we're framing this in terms of compassion and courage, I want to say a little bit about that because most of us on this call are church leaders of one sort or another. It's important, I think, to be able to make some connections between these practices and our faith. So from a Christian perspective, compassion is first and foremost a characteristic of God. Scripture is replete with stories about God's compassion, God's response to human suffering with relief and deliverance and care. And compassion has both an inner or affective and an outer sort of behavioral orientation. In both Hebrew and Greek, compassion exists in the inmost parts, in the bowels and in the womb, if you look at the language. And so it describes a sense of being pained at the core of your being and therefore moved to alleviate or participate in the healing of others' suffering. Okay. Courage, besides being, let me stop for a second. Besides compassion being first and foremost a characteristic of God, and frankly, in the New Testament, compassion is used exclusively for Jesus or the God figure in Jesus's parables. It's also then, in a secondary sense, referred to like as gifts of mercy. St. Paul talks about this. So, and we can see people in our own lives, people who are known throughout history, who clearly have a specific charism, a specific gift for compassion. And then beyond that, there is a sense in which all of us as Christians are called to compassion, to respond to one another with care, to seek to alleviate the suffering that exists in our worlds insofar as we are able, to borrow that phrase from St. Paul. So that's a bit of a framing of compassion. And then courage, I have found Brene Brown's work to be really helpful. We think of her work on empathy, but how she weaves in discussions about courage, I find to be brilliant. And in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, she writes this: the root of the word courage is cor, the Latin word for heart. In one of its earliest forms, the word courage had a very different definition than it does today. Courage originally meant to speak one's mind by telling all of one's heart. And then Brene Brown criticizes the way courage has gotten combined with heroic acts. And she's trying to bring us back to a more rudimentary understanding of courage that's about the everyday. And she goes on to say, ordinary courage is about putting our vulnerability on the line. And in today's world, that's pretty extraordinary. That's pretty extraordinary. So if we want to speak with courage and compassion, that begins from the perspective of nonviolent communication with listening. And listening then leads into leading, and then, or leading and speaking, and then speaking leads back to listening and refining our listening. So that the more volatile our situation is, whether that's a relationship or a specific relationship, a system, or a global context, the more volatile, the more important listening becomes, okay? And even if it's not volatile, the more change that an organization or a group is experiencing, the greater the shifts in the mission, the more important listening becomes. So we're going to take some time today as we do this to listen to ourselves and at least imagine listening to others with, again, courage and compassion. I'm going to get through one more slide in setting up nonviolent communication, and then I'll see if there are any questions. What I've put on the screen here is something developed by a woman named Inbal Kashtan, who's been one of the leaders throughout the US in developing nonviolent communication and raising up trainers throughout this country. And she kind of laid out what she called this NVC tree of life. And what becomes clear here is that the point of NVC, as she's depicted it, is connection. It's not about winning, persuading, or even compromising, because it's built on a trust that everyone's needs matter. These are true, authentic needs and should be taken to heart. And so entering into a conversation or situation, even that's a systemic conflict, begins with the intention to connect. And then there are outer modes of empathy and honesty, and an inner mode of self-empathy or self-connection. And that inner mode of self-empathy is portrayed as the roots and the trunk of a tree, and the outer mode the outer modes are portrayed as branches of the tree. When I learned nonviolent communication and was experiencing all of the volatility I mentioned in my denomination and in the church where I was serving, and trying to manage that while being a full-time PhD student, I was challenged to really focus first and foremost, and again, on the self-empathy or inner mode of nonviolent communication. And the people that I studied most intensively essentially taught that is what sustains us and brings us back home to ourselves, we might say, to God, and to a kind of groundedness that and then enables us to keep reaching out and connecting. So that's just a little bit of an overview of NVC, how I frame it conceptually. And let me stop the sharing and see if any questions or comments have come through in the chat at this point. Okay, that means that I can just keep going. But what I want to share with you now is what is considered to be the heart of nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. And it's an attunement to needs, an attunement to needs. It's the central basic skill in nonviolent communication to be able to identify and articulate one's own needs, and also hear the needs of another person or group or larger system. Now, many of us have been socialized to have negative connotations about our own needs in particular. And we also have lots of sort of biases against quote unquote neediness. So in order to dispel those right away, I want to hone in on how compassionate communication actually defines needs. Needs essentially are understood as qualities that contribute to life. Okay, qualities that contribute to life. All human beings have needs: basic physical, emotional, social, spiritual needs. And needs in this framework are understood as the underlying motivation for our choices, whether, and this is key, we are conscious of those needs or not. So we're trying to get our needs met in every moment. If I pick up my cup of coffee, I'm trying to meet a couple of needs. One, to keep myself alert, to keep myself hydrated, etc. Needs themselves, understood in this framework, have both a universality and a particularity. That when we look at the needs chart together, you'll see that, well, these are things that we all hold in common, but the meaning we attribute to these needs, how we pay attention to those needs, how we feel when those needs are met or unmet, that is very unique. So there's lots of ways that these needs also get interpreted and filtered culturally and then personally and psychologically. So they're both universal and particular. Needs in this model are valued equally. So there's not one set of needs that matter more than another. Though, as you'll see, there are some needs that if they aren't met, it would be almost impossible to meet other needs, which reminds us of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay. When our needs are chronically unmet, this is really important to mention, we may experience significant emotional pain. and we might need empathy. So empathy is a caring attunement to somebody else's needs. When our chronically unmet needs are triggered in a situation, we may need to step outside of that situation even and practice what is called self-empathy. Or in the debate tonight, you may need to mute or turn off your television because you get triggered, right? Probably significantly. So empathy is a caring attunement to others' needs, feelings, and needs. And self-empathy is a practice of attuning to our own feelings and needs when we are triggered. Okay. So that's a little bit of a framework of needs in this model. And what I would say from a Christian perspective is that this is really congruent with our essential interdependence as human beings. Think of the Apostle Paul's language when he says, the eye cannot say to the ear, I have no need of you, nor the hand to the foot, I have no need of you. We are essentially incomplete apart from our connection to God and our fellow humans. And we connect through our needs, right? And we also learn both in nonviolent communication and again through the Apostle Paul's exhortations to value others' needs as well as our own. And sometimes we neglect our own needs, sometimes we neglect others' needs. But in this model, we're paying attention to them all and saying that they matter, that they matter. So what I have here on the screen right now is essentially a representation of the handout. Oh, you can't see it because my background is blurred, but it's the needs inventory that was sent to you as a handout. There is no one exhaustive inventory of needs or definitive. I've seen many versions of this. I think it's a nice version because it categorizes some of these needs as related to things like connection or peace or meaning, but there's lots of ways to put this together. So what I would like you to take a few minutes to do on your own is to look at this list. Right? Look at this list of needs. Go through it, read through it, and notice what needs sort of jump out to you as familiar. Which ones seem unfamiliar? So that's the first round of taking a look at this inventory. And then after you do that, take a second round and notice, are there any particular needs that you would identify as met or unmet for you in this particular moment? And they may be met or unmet related to our time together or related to something that you are carrying with you. So I want to give you a few moments to do that on your own. And then we will send you into breakout rooms and give you a chance to chat with one another. What do you notice as needs that are familiar and unfamiliar to you? And which needs might you met or identify as particularly met or unmet in this moment? And if anyone has questions about those instructions, let us know. Okay, I've stopped the sharing because I want to give you a chance to share with one another. Um, so can we put folks into breakout rooms now for maybe about 4 minutes or so, 4 or 5 minutes, and then you can share with one another.
So the rooms are open and you should see a link that invites you to join those rooms. Looks like a few people are still waiting to join. Let's see if we can help them. There they go. Mm. Let's see. The only people that I see that are still not in the room is Hung. I wonder if he looks like he may be speaking with someone, so maybe he's not ready. And I'm not sure about Sherman. Okay. Um, that's fine. Nicole and Stacy, did you want to join the room or you'll be okay? These are both staff members. I think I'm gonna pause the recording too.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure on my screen if you were all back or not. So I want to hear from maybe a couple of groups in a moment or a couple of people, just because it helps me to connect with where you might be at or how you're hearing this material. But this capacity to identify and connect with needs, both our own and our others, again, it's this core skill. Because if we can do that, then we have a sense about what matters most to us and what possibly matters most to the other person when we are in situations of conflict or even standing across what feels like, impassable chasms. So it's the core skill because it's what enables us to see and understand, communicate, connect with our own humanity and the other's humanity. So I'm wondering if a couple of you just briefly would unmute and say something about what it was like to scan an inventory of needs and notice what was familiar or unfamiliar to you.
Hello, I was in group 3, and if I can summarize for our group, we were struck by the length of the number of needs in connection, but how few needs under honesty, play, and peace. Also, we thought we would move under physical well-being, water up to the top with air, food, and then water. And we also learned something new about there is such a thing as laugh yoga. One of our members shared with us that there is a movement now out there for laugh yoga, and how laughter releases certain chemicals in the brain that lead to healing.
Yes, so that laugh yoga, to use the language of NVC, is perhaps a very effective strategy to meet needs like healing, well-being, wholeness. Yeah. And certainly connection, lots of times. Yeah, thank you. Does one other person want to jump in? Just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I was in group 5, and myself and another person talked about how we found some of the points there on the sheet in the more of the political realm, without getting into details or partisan politics. But I pointed out that the parts under autonomy really struck me, especially because I feel frustrated that all the activism and compassionate communication is really stymied by the system in this country of, voter suppression, electoral college versus everyone having equal vote, and some things, along those lines. And that I did take to heart what you said about how, that all the good communication in the world is not an instant solution for everything. And another person in our group talked about being in a town sort of equally divided between political parties, and that she works with both and is stress listening. But that at the end of the day, she still felt she couldn't put like political signs up for being, for fear. And that was kind of the direction our group took.
Yeah. If I could just pull on a couple of threads from what you said. One, I really appreciate the way you've articulated how sort of fundamental needs for freedom, choice, independence. I mean, lots of words we could give to convey those needs can become stymied or really difficult to meet in complex systems. And the way systems have layers, a layering effect that really suppress those needs or keep those needs from being met for individuals, and certainly particular groups of individuals. And it's very complex and would go beyond simply, communication. One of the things Sandana mentioned when introducing me is that I worked as an administrator, and I was a dean of diversity and cultural competency, and a system that had just deep historic racist, homophobic tendencies. And so while nonviolent communication frequently sustained me and helped me communicate, there were lots of things beyond communication that needed to happen in that system for there to be lasting change. Okay. The second piece that I wanted to pull on is that part of what your comment reminded me of is the way that needs can cluster together, so that if one need is met, we can have a whole cluster of other needs that are related that can be met. And the same is true for unmet needs. So if we have a basic needs for freedom and choice that aren't being met, then, I mean, that can, like, physically over time, we know from trauma studies, even the way that then impacts us and future generations. And so, you know, the interlacing of these needs is just important for us to pay attention to as leaders, I think. So thank you. Another piece that you will not find in most writings about nonviolent communication, Professor Hunsinger and I talk about it in our book, is this notion that needs live in us in 3 ways. And so as a leader, if you're trying to connect with your needs or another's needs or a group's needs, it's important to remember this, that needs have meaning. So it's kind of a cognitive level. Needs elicit, when they're met or unmet, certain feelings for us. And then that impacts our body. So the story I have told for many years as I've taught this has to do with the fact that the only thing in all of my schooling that I ever failed was playtime in kindergarten. And this is a true story. I failed playtime, and my mother asked me why, and I came home and I said, because I'm there to learn, not play. So I, as an oldest child in the particular family system with my particular psychological makeup, have had to learn the importance of something like play over the years. And so when I connect to that need for play, which is related to joy and humor, I feel a certain amount of delight and surprise because I forget that that is a need of mine. Okay. And it has meaning for me because of my history of neglecting that need and completely missing it. That goes back to my early childhood. But when I find ways to play, and most recently I do that when I'm coaching my daughter's softball team, my body relaxes. I can feel my shoulders relax, the tension in my hips, because I'm old enough to have tension in my hips all the time. That eases. I move with greater flexibility because it impacts my body. So when we take time as leaders, particularly in the midst of vitriolic or highly contentious situations, to connect with our needs, it impacts us on all of these levels. So, having said that, I want to then shift into how we work with needs in contexts where we are on the receiving end of really hard to hear messages. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And what you see here are 4 basic orientations or responses to vitriol, or you could just put in there any hard to hear message. Again, compassionate communication or nonviolent communication aims for 3 things: authentic connection with ourself, that's the trunk of the tree, self-empathy; empathetic reception of others, that's that deep listening and understanding, empathy; and then honest expression, which, because I've lived in the Midwest, I'm from New York, New Jersey, but I've lived in the Midwest long enough to have to say that is not niceness. Honesty in NVC is not niceness. It can be really fierce, but it's grounded in connection to humanity, mind, and others. Okay. So those 3 skill sets, self-empathy, empathy, and honesty, are actually this 4 basic orientations sort of helps us with all of those basic skills, right? So when we hear hard to hear messages, personal criticism, deeply embedded sexist, racist, homophobic attitudes, we have 4 ways to respond, 2 of which are life alienating, 2 of which are life giving in the framework of nonviolent communication. Okay. And again, as an aside, we are all on the receiving end of such messages indirectly. If you are on social media, you're not going to get through a day without being on the receiving end of those, at least indirectly, sort of violent judgment spoken about other groups of people. So the first option that we have, which is what we're more socialized to do than not, is to hear the other person's or group's words as an attack and then lash out in response. So we may think we're justified in attacking the other person or group back. We may become intent on proving ourselves right. We may feel self-righteous and lash out. We may think the other person or group deserves punishment. They need to be put in their place, et cetera, et cetera. And anger might escalate, and the chasm between us deepens. And instead of holding the other person with compassion, which doesn't mean agreement or even sort of certainly not justifying someone's actions, doesn't mean that, but holding them as another human being. Okay. When we lash out, we deepen the chasm, and we fail to do that. And from the perspective of nonviolent communication, that's the baseline for situations that devolve further into violence. Now, a second option that we have in response to vitriol or hard to hear messages is not just lashing out, but lashing in. Most of us are socialized to do this as well. We might agree with the judgment, the criticism, the hurtful statement, okay? And then lash in, magnifying our own faults, having a lot of internal negative self-talk, self-criticism, self-blame. This is a place where we might, in a more complex way, internalize oppression, which of course is what happens. And lashing in this way sets us up for things like chronic stress, feelings of shame, burnout. And if this is our default mode, then we're going to be in a place where we're experiencing powerlessness and depression as well. So lashing out and lashing in is what most of us are socialized to do. It's what we are kind of second nature, so to speak, because we're socialized to do this from a young age. And instead of that, what nonviolent communication wants to train us to do is to connect out and connect in. So in contrast to lashing out, we can empathize with the person or group who spoke the hard to hear message without agreeing with them, okay? So connecting out is the alternative to lashing out. And in this, we try to hear the painful feelings. We try to imagine the unmet needs or the needs that somebody or a group of people are attempting to meet. We try to listen for what matters most to this other group. And sometimes we need to sit with our needs inventory to even imagine what might matter to another person or a group, okay? Now, there are some simple situations in which a person, for instance, might accuse us of being inconsiderate, and we might know immediately that their need is for consideration, right? Consideration. And when we connect out, instead of attacking them back, lashing out and saying, or even thinking, well, I'm not inconsiderate, you're misinterpreting all of this, you're the one who's inconsiderate, those kinds of processes. Instead of doing that, we simply notice that the other person maybe needs consideration. Maybe they need rest. Maybe they need spaciousness. Depending on the context, they could have a whole host of unmet needs. So that's the connecting out piece. We try to discern what needs are unmet for that person or what needs they are trying to meet. Then the next piece is the connecting in. In contrast to lashing in, we now attempt to empathize with ourselves. Instead of heaping blame or judgment upon our own heads, we connect with what is going on inside of us. If we feel hurt by what someone else has said, we explore that hurt to figure out what our needs are. And it may help at this point to stay attuned to ourselves in a bodily way. What happens in our bodies when we ask ourselves what it is about this hard to hear message that we are finding so hurtful? Okay. So we're paying attention to the feelings as a kind of gateway to our own needs. Just to give you a really quick example of this in my own life, I was in a system recently where I heard a leader say something like, we don't need to have specific LGBTQIA education for our youth because they already know that we are an inclusive community. They already are accepting, and we don't need to do any more education along these lines, except perhaps informally. And I was really triggered by this statement. And my lashing in, which I did all in my head instead of on the other person, or I'm sorry, my lashing out, which was all internal because I know enough to close my mouth, included things like, are you that clueless that you think we've already created systems marked by so much equity and inclusiveness that we don't need to keep working on it? Are you not aware that cultural competency includes more than a nod to inclusivity? Have you not listened to kids in school or kids in our youth group who actually are using pretty homophobic jokes at time, and my kids coming home and being hurt by that? So that was all of my lashing out. I was a little more fierce, but I'm not connected to the fierceness. And then what I had to do was just connect out and realize sort of what are the needs of this person. Well, in some sense, there was a longing for acknowledgement of how sort of far the church had come. There was also a longing, I think, underneath for respect for our youth and how at least a lot of our youth in this context are further along in creating cultures of belonging and inclusivity than some of our adults. So it was a longing for respect for our youth. And it was that understanding that then enabled me to go to that person in another meeting and actually articulate some of the ways that we need to grow. So I could do it from a place of care rather than a place of judgment, which enabled it to be heard. So that's just one really quick example of how having this model of understanding how I lash out, how I might lash in, how I connect out, and then how I connect in. If I had judged myself in the system, perhaps for not communicating in a particular way at a particular moment, that would have been like a lashing in. In this instance, I didn't. And then the connecting in would have been something like, well, I'm going to, have compassion and acceptance for myself and my commitment to ongoing growth and learning. And I'm going to realize that in the moment of I was seeking to meet needs also for thoughtfulness in how I responded. So I didn't respond right at that moment. So I hope that is somewhat clear. What I would like you to do is to take a look at your handout, if you have it, on 4 responses to vitriol and other difficult to hear messages. And if you don't have it, that's okay, because I have a screen shot that will help you with this particular exercise. And what I'd like you to do is take a little bit of time just to practice this lashing out, lashing in, connecting out, connecting in. And it does take some time to do this. And the first thing to start with is come up with one very concrete, simple, hard to hear message that you've been on the receiving end of recently. Do not choose something that triggered years of chronically unmet needs. Choose something simple. So and so, made an offhand comment about what you were wearing or what you said in a meeting or something like that, because we want to practice these skills with things that are less emotionally fraught in order to learn the skill so that you can then do it in more emotionally fraught contexts or situations. So the first thing to do is to write down sort of what was said, what you heard, what that difficult message was, and then take a few minutes to see if you can identify how you might have lashed out or lashed in response to that message. And then from there, try to connect out what maybe mattered most to the other person, what needs might have been alive for them. Now we're guessing because you don't have the opportunity to check it out with them. So at this minute, it's like an empathetic guess in this minute. And then see if you can also connect in what needs of yours were alive or unmet in response to this hard to hear message. So I'm going to leave this on the screen, which means I can't see if someone has a clarification kind of question. One of our leaders that are managing the chats, can you let me know if there's a question for clarification at this point that I should address?
There are no questions at this moment.
Okay. So I want to give you like 7 to 8 minutes to actually try doing this individually. And then we'll come back and I'll hear from a few of you about what it was like and try to give you some coaching, because this really provides it provides a pathway to that courageous and compassionate communication across ideological divides. So we'll start that now. Okay, that's close to 7 or 8 minutes. And this is a very shortened, abbreviated time to do an exercise like this. Again, if I had my druthers, we'd have a week together to learn these skills and practice them in depth. I'm trying to give you a taste of it. So let me see if there are any questions for clarity first about this.
Theresa, I'm not
Sure.
sure that we can hear you. Can everyone hear the presenter? You are able to hear? Okay, thank you.
So you can hear me okay now? Okay. Oh, good. All right. Glad to hear it. So, questions about this particular practice?
I have a question.
Sure.
It was easy for me to figure out an example. And how does one do this quickly
Yeah, it's
when
a
you're
great
in the
question.
moment?
Yeah, in the moment. So you do it quickly in the moment by practicing it outside of the moment a lot. I mean, that is really true.
Mhm.
So, I mean, even with the, all of my years of experience, there are also times if you're triggered enough, you're not going to be as grounded in the moment, right? Or be able to, for instance, connect out. Like the example I gave where a coworker of mine made the comment about LGBTQIA education for youth, like it's so connected to my own history and my family that it took me outside of that context to really get to, oh, a part of this is deep respect for the youth. Like now for that particular person. But what I could do in the moment was this. I held on to two things. The awareness that for him, there was something that really mattered to him at stake. So I had a consciousness that he had needs, not that he was foolish. I remembered we're recording, right? Or clueless, or some of the other judgments I had, right? And then I also could connect more readily to my own need, which was for understanding and growth and sort of truth telling in a system, those needs. And that made a difference for how I handled it in the moment. Yeah. But you have to build like muscle memory, particularly with needs. A lot of us have been trained to think about our feelings. We haven't been trained necessarily to think about needs in this way or identify them. So it takes practice outside of context like this or a triggering moment. Yeah. Any other question or comment about what the exercise was like to go through in a really abbreviated manner?
It looks
Okay,
like
I
Thea.
see a raised hand. Go ahead. Is it Thea?
Yes.
Go
Hi,
ahead.
thanks. I was surprised that going through all of the scenarios was so helpful. I think that my instinct probably, in the lashing out is to just suppress that instinct or suppress what it would have been to lash out. And that I think there in allowing myself to think through what that would have looked like gave me more to work with in terms of the connection. So that was surprising.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that because most of us are socialized to not lash out. And there's wisdom in that, right? There's a lot of wisdom in that. But if we cut off from our judgments and we don't listen to them, we cut off from the aliveness of them. So our judgments are a pathway to identifying our needs, right? I mean, I had a colleague once that he wrote a book on listening, and it was just like notorious in the whole system that if you got in a meeting with him, he would talk the whole meeting in a really what I judge to be domineering way. And I had all of these judgments about him. And when I realized by listening to my judgments was like how much I valued things like collaboration and inclusion in a community, and also like integrity, not perfect, right? But integrity, so that there would be some congruence between what he wrote and how he lived in the system. Yeah, thank you. Because of our time and because I want to respect your time, I am going to move us on and continue sharing, because I want to point out how the capacity to practice connecting out in response to our lashing out and connecting in to response to lashing in actually sets us up for practicing compassionate honesty. Compassionate honesty. So this kind of honesty is full of courage and conviction. It's fierce, it's life-serving, because it's grounded in an intention to connect with others, not to denigrate them or dehumanize them. It treats others with respect, even when we strongly disagree with them. And in this sense, compassionate honesty or nonviolent communication honesty is assertive. It's not nice. It's not passive. It flows from connection to our most cherished values and needs. And it's empowering. On an interpersonal level, simple expressions of compassionate honesty, especially after we've heard the other with empathy, have a way of inspiring or even freeing other people around us to risk opening their hearts and mouths so that they can be seen and known more fully. So I think that assertive, authentic, and empowering speech of this sort builds community. It builds community. And then on a larger socio-political level, compassionate honesty can name patterns of behavior that fail to meet our most fundamental needs, and fail to meet them not just for ourselves, but for those we love, for groups of people, and indeed for systems upon systems. So what we do is that we want to speak in situations where there are patterns that have undermined human needs. We want to speak in those situations with a life-giving, fierce honesty. And we want to set aside, for instance, our evaluations and moralistic judgments, even if they're accurate or correct, right? And NVC trains us to translate those into observations, like a concrete statement or thought that reflects what we've heard, seen, or remembered in reference to a specific situation, event, or interaction, right? So by very definition, observations are distinct from our interpretations, our evaluations, and our judgments. And evaluations take lots of forms. Could be a label, could be a diagnosis, could be a static assessment of someone. The problem is that evaluations often increase defensiveness and resistance in the other person or group. And they prevent mutual understanding and hinder ongoing dialogue. Value judgments, though, are something different. Value judgments, compared to moralistic judgments, support mutual understanding and perseverance in connection. They name what matters most to us, and that's the needs that we have for ourselves and for others. A value judgment that has an observation embedded in it is going to articulate the precise thing that's been done or said that undermines needs for a group of people or person, right? It just is going to say it without layers of self-righteousness or moralism. Okay, so value judgments maintain our connection to what matters most to us. They connect us to those qualities of life in shalom, for instance, that we long for. So when we have been able to connect in and connect out, we can move into compassionate honesty and begin that, or sort of intersperse it with observations about what we've seen or heard or remembered that we identify as undermining human needs. So often, in a very volatile situation, it helps to articulate maybe not 10 observations, but to 1, 2, or 3 observations, and then go right to how those actions or inactions undermine fundamental needs and how much those needs matter. So this is another basic skill in compassionate communication, the capacity to translate our evaluations into observations. It's similar to the kind of moves we would make when we're trying to translate our judgments into needs, but will support us in having a fuller conversation. The other skill that I want to mention to you that's really important in compassionate honesty is the capacity to make a request. And requests are different than demands. Requests often use positive action language. So, would you be willing to do X, Y, or Z? Would you be willing to change X, Y, or Z? They're also really specific. So to go back to the example that I use where I got triggered recently in my system, an effective request would have been something like, would you be willing to sit with me and 3 other queer staff members to listen to our experience and assessment of sort of how our youth are living or not living into our deepest values around inclusion, right? So, and if I wanted to get even more specific, I would say, would you be willing to set an appointment with me and 3 other queer members in the next 2 weeks to talk about this very topic? See how specific that is? And it's not, would you please go learn something more about cultural competency and LGBTQIA inclusion? That could come across as condescending, depending on how I said it. It was really specific. That would then contribute to my needs for understanding, acceptance, and growth in our community. Okay. So learning to make requests rather than demands or threats is a really important skill that we don't have a lot of time to delve into or practice today, but that I want to highlight for you. And it's also something that you can learn about either in Marshall Rosenberg's book on nonviolent communication or in the book that Deborah Hunsinger and I wrote, Transforming Church Conflict. And then finally, something that's really important to me is that when undertaken as a spiritual practice, self-empathy, that connecting in, can lead to prayer quite naturally, because ultimately God is the source of our needs. And I'm reminded of the story in Mark 10 about Bartimaeus, and I'll read it to you. This is starting with verse 46. They came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called him, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. A couple of things that strike me about that story. One, Bartimaeus persisted in holding on to his needs rather than letting go of them, even when those around him tried to shut him up. So in NVC communities, they often quip, hold onto your needs tightly, but hold on to your strategies or requests to meet those needs lightly. So he holds onto his needs tightly and persists. And then Jesus asked the question, "What do you want me to do?" Or "What do you need?" That to me is the "what do you need?" And it's not only that God meets our needs, it is also the case that in Christ, all our needs are met, right? We just don't experience that fully in the here and now. And so when our best efforts, and I've had plenty of these in my career, fail to transform the conflict around us, we find peace in God through Jesus. When we fail to speak with empathy, or some speak with honesty, or listen with empathy in the ways we hope, we find forgiveness and acceptance in Christ. And when we lament our desperately unfulfilled desires, it's the Spirit of God that sustains us by reminding us of God's promises that in Christ all things hold together. And I think when we dare to pray to God and with one another with honesty and vulnerability, that is, with courage, by acknowledging the despair related to our unmet needs, as well as the sheer joy related to our met needs, it's then that we break through to communion with God and one another. And it's when we pour our hearts out to God and to one another that we are united in love. And that's my ultimate hope for you, that as you lead in these very challenging times, you would find your way back home to God through this pathway of connecting to your needs and being reminded, if you can't discern what another's needs are, simply that they have them and they too are beloved of God. So thank you so much. I will get information out to all of you. Here's some resources for your ongoing learning. If you have any questions that have come up, feel free to email me and I'm happy to be in conversation. And thanks for spending your time with me and one another today.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. And it's such a rich webinar. I'm like, where's part two? I'm already ready for part two to hear more about it. Would you just help me do jazz hands or something to thank Dr. Latini and just to say thank you for being with us? If you have not received the resources, let us know. They were emailed out to everyone who registered. And so we hope that you have them. Look forward to a part two as we can get it scheduled. Our next webinar will be on the 1st of October and is around community organizing, establishing a community in a culture of partnerships. That's the next webinar that's coming up. Thank you so much for being with us. Blessings and peace. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone. Be well.